Welcome back to Next Gen Console Watch 2020, our new show following all the news and rumors on the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X. I'm Jamin Hatfield. Joining me this week is Ryan McCaffrey, host of IGN's Xbox podcast, Podcast Unlocked.
Howdy.
And Jonathan Dornbush, host of IGN's PlayStation podcast, Podcast Beyond. So this week, we got to look at the new controller for the PlayStation 5, the DualSense. We'll see how it stacks up to the Series X controller. Let's start with what everyone notices first. When you see the DualSense, it's striking new two-tone visual design. Jonathan, what was your first impression when you saw the new controller?
I really like it. The more I sit with it, the more I like it. I think partially just because it's different. Sony has been working with the framework of the DualShock since essentially the original PlayStation era. We have had largely the same form factor. And so to really see a at least somewhat significant visual change is cool just because we're not used to getting that. Like, obviously, there's something tried and true to the DualShock as well as the Xbox controller, and of course, Microsoft has got aired on the side of if it's not broke, don't fix it, and I think that makes a ton of sense. But I like Sony taking this ambitious gambit with how much it visually strikes you, especially because that's going to allow for a lot of different color combinations and probably different colors they're going to try to sell us, but I'll probably be guilty of buying some.
Ryan, what was your first impression of the DualSense?
I like it. I definitely like the look of it. It looks like a BMW i8 made into a video game controller. That's a good thing. That's a beautiful sports car. Look it up if you're not sure what I'm talking about there. But I think it almost certainly tells us that the console itself is going to be white, or at the very least two-tone, but and maybe the console's black with white second tone. But I would imagine that it is going to largely match the controller and be a primarily white console. So in a weird like history repeating itself in a sense, the 360 and the PS3 was a white console against a black console, and now it seems like we're going to do that again, except the color roles are going to be reversed. But yeah, it's definitely a pretty controller from a just purely aesthetic perspective. It certainly looks nice.
Yeah, PlayStation hasn't ever had a white console before. They've all been black except for the PS1, which was gray. Jonathan, what do you think about the moving away from the DualShock name?
It's going to take a little while for me to want to say DualSense and not just keep saying DualShock 5 because before we knew what this was, we've just been saying DualShock 5. Obviously, they're trying to keep the legacy of it. No one really caught on to the PS3's 6-axis. We still don't really say that name much. So I get that they're keeping it in line, and I guess that, opens up the door to someday there being a DualShock 5 that maybe doesn't have a lot of the extra features that the DualSense will have, but I like it because it does really speak to what I think PlayStation is trying to do with the PS5. Whether or not that proves to be a good idea, we'll find out. But them putting sense in the word, I think really emphasizes their desire to make the actual game feel, the player's reaction to a game matter as much as what's going on screen.
Mm-hmm. We know they're adding adaptive triggers and haptic feedback. We'll touch on that a little bit more in a bit. But what do you think of the new light bar layout? Apparently the light bar is not going to be on top. Now it's two little slivers on each side of the touchpad, which they are also keeping.
Yeah, so I mean, the light bar is definitely one of the biggest culprits when it comes to the DualShock 4's terrible battery life. So that being removed isn't a bad thing in that sense. It does bring up the question of what will happen with PSVR backward compatibility, because a lot of games that are just DualShock or have DualShock 4 compatibility in PSVR use the light bar to see where your hands are tracking. So how they get around that, we reached out to Sony and they didn't have any comment on that DualShock 4, whether you might be able to use DualShock 4s or if there will be some light usage from the DualSense that'll help with these games. But I like its sort of nature as an accent on the front of the controller. Like everything about the face of the controller I really love just from a visual perspective. I think it looks really clean and neat. And whereas the bright light shining into your television and then being reflected back at you every time a game loads isn't really great on the DualShock. So I think this makes a lot of more sense with the DualSense.
Now, one of the cool new features that was introduced in the DualShock 4 was the share button. That's now being replaced with a create button. What do you make of that?
I love this. I really think that Sony will tout it, and I think it is fair of them to tout that the share button has been one of the biggest advancements, as simple as it is for them this generation, because, man, photo modes are one of my favorite things that have become so prevalent in video games this generation, and especially Sony first-party games have been great at giving you really robust photo modes, whether it's the... there are dozens and dozens of options in the Days Gone photo mode. The Spider-Man photo mode lets you essentially create your own comic book covers. They've done a lot with that. And so I think what the create button intends, because they didn't really tell us what this means, I think we're going to be seeing an evolution of what we've been able to do with the share button, and whether that is taking more advantage of. There's an app in your PS4 called Share Factory that I think almost no one uses these days, but it's been there since day one, and you probably buried it in a folder. I think this is them kind of saying, hey, we're going to put some of this functionality that's maybe in Share Factory, that's maybe in photo modes, that is, you see people like Sunhee Legend on Twitter making these amazing GIFs of games. I think they're trying to say, let's give that to everyone and give everyone a chance to create shareable moments with their games more often, and I love that.
So we know the DualSense will include the DualShock 4's speaker. They're also adding a built-in microphone for some chatting. And it wasn't clear yesterday during the announcement whether or not it would have a headphone jack, but Sony has since clarified, yes, it still has a headphone jack. We ran a poll on IGN.com asking our users what they thought of the PS5 DualSense controller. Over 25,000 votes, 49%, nearly half of respondents said they love it. So a positive response from the IGN community about the new controller. Ryan, how do you think it compares to the Series X controller? It seems like it certainly seems to be a bigger departure from last gen than Xbox is taking moving forward. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. I mean, it's Microsoft themselves say that the Series X controller is a smaller departure because everybody, their research and their surveys showed that everybody was happy with the Xbox One controller, and I'm one of those people. I mean, I think the biggest, most obvious point of criticism you can level at all Xbox controllers over the years has been the D-pad. They've taken steps at that, particularly with the Elite controllers, and now they've taken that sort of dish style D-pad that's similar to at least it's clearly inspired by what's on the more expensive Elite controller, and they're putting that standard, a version of that standard, on the Series X controller. So that's, but as far as form factor, they talked about they shaved down the top areas near the bumper a little bit to try and make it a little bit more ergonomic for smaller hands. But really, I would argue there wasn't a lot of room for improvement in the Xbox gamepad, and I don't say that in like a console fanboy way. It's just
Sure.
People like that controller. It's been a favorite controller for a lot of people for a long time, and they did add the share button. They absolutely followed Sony's lead on that, building that into the Series X controller, and the Bluetooth low energy setting so that it can hang out using less power as it's idling. But yeah, it's that Microsoft's bolder design choice came in the form factor of the console itself. Granted, we haven't seen the PS5 yet, but they Sony, the DualSense is pretty out there relative to previous PlayStation controllers. The Xbox Series X console design is out there relative to not only previous Xbox consoles, but pretty much every other previous console too. So I'm curious now if the PS5 will look pretty traditional rectangle, and the controller is going to be, and if it's going to be kind of that inverse relationship again between the two companies, or if the PS5 itself will have a bolder console design to match the controller.
Well, the new haptic feedback and the adaptive triggers seem to be where the whole DualSense name is coming from. But what is haptic feedback? How does it work? IGN's tech editor, Bo Moore, can explain.
Thanks, Damon. One of the features that Sony is touting on the new DualSense controller is haptic feedback. It's a term you may have already heard before, but what is it, and how is it different from the way our controllers currently vibrate? Haptic feedback, or just haptics for short, refers to simulating the sense of touch. This is how our phones give us a little buzz to simulate key presses when you're touching the on-screen keyboard, whereas in controllers we're used to rumble or other forms of force feedback, but with a few exceptions, most controllers just have a single motor handling vibrations. Haptics are a bit more complex. With regular vibrations, you just have two settings, on and off. Or in the case of the DualShock controller, which has two motors, it can do off, low, and high. Haptics, on the other hand, allow for a finer control, a sliding scale of intensity instead of just an on or off. That means varying types of sensation depending on what's happening in the game. Perhaps a slight pitter of vibrations for a light rainstorm that gradually ramps up as the storm intensifies. Haptics also allow for a more delicate positioning of vibrations, buzzing different parts of the controller depending on the direction of incoming gunfire or maybe the location of explosions. Think of it like the upgrade from regular to surround sound. It's a subtle difference, but I'm really excited for anything the next-gen consoles can do to make games feel more and more immersive. Back to you, Damon.
Thanks, Bo. Okay, what do you guys think? Is haptic feedback going to be a game changer for next-gen consoles? You know, the DualShock 4 had a couple of features that, in hindsight, didn't end up being quite as significant as Sony might have hoped, like the touchpad and the light bar. Is haptic feedback actually going to be something that people want and that developers use?
I think it could be. If Sony commits to it, and it's weird. All three console manufacturers have had similar features over the years, including now, and really not stayed committed to them. And I feel like they've kind of faded away. I mean, in the case of Microsoft with the Xbox One has had the adaptive triggers on its controller this entire generation. And outside of the two Forza developers, Playground Games and Turn 10, where it's really cool if you're on the track, you're going around the corner, and if you really jam on the brake, you can feel like the brake disc grab. Like there's a real subtle nuance to it that's really neat. But outside of Forza, very few other developers have taken advantage of it, first or third party. And I would argue Nintendo the same way with the Switch, the HD Rumble. They had 1-2 Switch as a launch title that was basically a showcase for HD Rumble. But since then, I feel like there's Rumble certainly, but the specific awesome HD Rumble, we don't see a ton of it, to the point where the Switch Lite doesn't even have HD Rumble. So if Sony commits to it, I think it could be really cool. And hopefully if they commit to it, third parties will follow suit.
Jonathan, what do you think?
Yeah, it's one of those things where, every generation people do try to introduce new gameplay elements and things we usually end up calling gimmicks, because at the end of the day, they don't end up working. Mm-hmm. Not only did that happen with the DualShock 4, though, I still like the touchpad a little bit, but the DualShock 4 and the Vita and its back touchpad, a couple developers used it well, and then no one else used it. What is nice, though, at least going forward with adaptive triggers and haptic feedback, is the Xbox One controllers and the Xbox Series X controllers are carrying through what they introduced this generation. So at least on a third-party level, people can, if they're developing something to take advantage of what the DualSense is doing, they can also presumably put some of that into the Xbox Series X version as well, and maybe even a Switch port. So uniformity throughout the industry, I think, will help a long way, but it is going to have to be PlayStation proving that these are useful things and not just gimmicks you want to use every few games. Just to point out quickly, Robert Krekel, the audio lead from Naughty Dog, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, tweeted out after the DualSense reveal, very stoked about the new controller for PS5, lots of very cool opportunities integrating audio with haptic feedback. So that's, a PS5 DualSense specific case with that speaker, but already devs, I guess, are starting to think of it internally. And so I do hope we see, at least in the first, if not second and third wave of major PS5 games, people really taking advantage of this stuff.
Well, that's a literal DualSense too. If we're talking about hearing and touch, it's getting very literal there.
All right, let's transition from hardware to software for a bit. Last week, we talked about a lot of Xbox news on the show, and we polled the audience, which new Xbox game studio are you most excited to see a game from? And the clear winner with 41% was Obsidian.
Wow.
Most recently did Outer Worlds. In the past have done stuff like Fallout New Vegas. Ryan, does that result surprise you?
Not surprised at all. They are certainly the biggest name on that list, and arguably the most accomplished. Between you, Damon, you mentioned Fallout New Vegas, Outer Worlds recently. Mm-hmm. They've done a lot of great stuff over the years. I voted for the Initiative, actually, just because they're a total wild card. They're going to be building something new, whether that's based on an old Microsoft IP or something totally new, remains to be seen. And then, hard to argue with the second place on that, which was Ninja Theory, Hellblade 2. That is going to be the big narrative-driven single-player game that is exactly what Xbox has been lacking. So not at all surprised to see the vote shake down that way. But yeah, Obsidian, good people over there.
Well, while we're on the topic of games, you've no doubt heard by now that the ESA has officially canceled E3 2020. So IGN is taking up the mantle to bring you tons of exciting new game announcements. First look gameplay, interviews with your favorite developers, and more, starting this June with our Summer of Gaming event. Look for new show segments with 2K, Square Enix, Sega, Bandai Namco, Amazon, Google Stadia, Twitter, Devolver Digital, THQ Nordic, and more as part of the showcase. We'll have more details here on Next Gen Console Watch 2020, our daily news show, news, games, and more, and of course, IGN.com as we get closer to the big event. Before we go, we have a new poll for you to vote on for next week. What Next Gen controller feature are you most excited for? Is it the DualSense haptic feedback, that create button, or are you really into adaptive triggers? Head over to IGN.com to vote, and we'll share the results with you next week. And that will do it for this edition of Next Gen Console Watch 2020. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Bo. We'll be back next Friday, 6 a.m. Pacific, 9 a.m. Eastern, with more news and rumors on PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X. We'll see you then.